You know, there are moments in life when you realize that everything you thought you knew about justice, about fairness, about how the world works, can crumble in the span of a single day. I'm sitting here in my living room in this small Texas town, surrounded by photographs that tell the story of a life that was broken into pieces and then rebuilt from the ground up. My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 67 years old, and I want to tell you about the 3 years that changed everything. I believed about forgiveness, about revenge, and about what it really means to be free. 3 years. That is how long I spent behind bars for something I never did. 3 years of my life stolen by a lie so calculated, so cruel, that it still takes my breath away when I think about it. But what I'm going to share with you today isn't just about those 3 years in prison. It is about the years that followed, when I discovered that physical bars weren't the only thing that could imprison a person. It is about the moment when I held the power to destroy the woman who destroyed me and the choice I made that changed everything. Ivy never told this story publicly before. For 25 years, Ivy carried this inside me, sharing it only with a few close friends and family members. But lately, I've been feeling this pull, this need to speak about what happened to me. Maybe it is because I see so much anger in the world today, so much hatred and desire for revenge. Maybe it was because I understand that feeling better than most people ever will. You see, when someone steals 3 years of your life, destroys your reputation, takes away your career, and leaves you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a heart full of rage, you start to understand what real hatred feels like. You start to plan things, dark things, things that would make that person pay for what they did to you. And for a long time, that's exactly what I did. But before I tell you about the revenge I planned, about the moment I came face to face with the woman who lied about me in court, who watched me get handcuffed and taken away while she knew the truth, I need you to understand something. I need you to know who I was before all of this happened. Because the Margaret Thompson who went to prison in 1998 was not the same woman who came out in 2001. And the woman who came out was definitely not the woman I am today. I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll take a moment to think about it. Have you ever subscribed to a channel where someone was brave enough to share their deepest, most painful truth? If this story touches your heart, if you believe in the power of transformation and forgiveness, please hit that subscribe button. I'd love to know where you're watching from, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means more to me than you know, and it helps me continue sharing these stories that I believe can change lives. Back in 1998, I was 42 years old and living what most people would consider a blessed life. I had been a registered nurse for 18 years, working at the county hospital in our small Texas town. I loved my job, loved helping people during their most vulnerable moments. There is something special about being able to comfort someone who is in pain, to hold their hand when they re-scared, to be there during those crucial moments when life hangs in the balance. I lived in a modest but comfortable house on Maple Street, the same house where I live today. It had a white picket fence, a small garden where I grew tomatoes and roses, and a front porch where I'd sit in the evenings watching the neighbors walk by. It was the kind of life that might seem ordinary to some, but it felt like everything to me. I had worked hard to build that life, to create that sense of stability and peace. My husband Robert had passed away just 2 years earlier, in 1996. He'd been the love of my life, my high school sweetheart, and losing him to cancer at the age of 46 had been devastating. But I was slowly learning to live with the grief, to find moments of joy again. I was starting to think about maybe traveling, maybe taking up painting, maybe even going back to school to become a nurse practitioner. The future felt full of possibilities, even though it looked different than I had originally planned. I had 2 grown children, David and Sarah, who were both married and starting families of their own. David lived about an hour away in Austin, working as a teacher, and Sarah lived in Dallas with her husband and their 2 young children. They called regularly, visited on weekends, and life felt like it was moving in the right direction. I was learning to be a grandmother, which brought me more joy than I had expected after Robert E.'s death. My neighbors knew me as the woman who would bring casseroles when someone was sick, who would water your plants when you went out of town, who would always have a kind word and a listening ear. I volunteered at the local food bank twice a week, and I was part of the prayer circle at the Methodist Church where I'd been a member for over 20 years. People trusted me. They respected me. When someone needed help, Margaret Thompson was one of the first people they thought to call. That is why what happened next was so shocking, so impossible for people to believe at first. Because how could someone like me, someone who had spent her entire adult life helping others, someone who had never even gotten a speeding ticket, suddenly be accused of theft? How could Margaret Thompson, the woman who found a wallet in the grocery store parking lot and spent an hour tracking down the owner, be capable of stealing thousands of dollars from her own neighbor? Sarah Mitchell lived 3 houses down from me on Maple Street. She was a woman about my age, divorced, with no children. She worked as a secretary at the insurance office downtown, and on the surface, we had what most people would call a friendly relationship. We'd wave to each other when we got our mail. We'd chat briefly if we ran into each other at the store. I had even invited her to a few neighborhood barbecues over the years, though she rarely attended. But I didn't know Sarah Mitchell. Not really. I didn't know about the jealousy that had been growing inside her for years. I didn't know how much she resented my stable life, my comfortable house, my loving family. I didn't know that she had been watching me, studying my routines, learning my habits. I didn't know that she had been planning something that would destroy everything I had worked for. It started with small things. Sarah would make comments about my house, about how nice it must be to have such a beautiful garden, about how lucky I was to have children who visited so often. At first, I thought she was just being friendly, maybe a little lonely. I tried to include her more, invited her for coffee a few times, but there was always something in her eyes, something that made me feel uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was getting ready for work when I heard the knock on my door. When I opened it, there were 2 police officers standing on my front porch, their faces serious and professional. My first thought was that something had happened to one of my children. My heart started pounding, and I could barely get the words out to ask what was wrong. But it wasn't about my children. It was about me. They told me I was being accused of theft, that someone had reported missing money and jewelry, and that evidence pointed to me as the perpetrator. I stood there in my nursing uniform, my purse in my hand, ready to head to work to help save lives. And these officers were telling me that I was a criminal. I laughed at first. I actually laughed because it was so absurd, so impossible. I told them there had been some mistake, that I would never steal anything from anyone. I offered to let them search my house, to look through my bank records, to do whatever they needed to do to prove my innocence. I was confident that this would all be cleared up quickly, that whoever had made this false accusation would realize their mistake. But as the officers continued talking, as they told me about the evidence that had been found, about the witness statements that had been given, my laughter died in my throat. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was serious. This was real. And somehow, some way, I was at the center of it. The evidence was damning. Jewelry that belonged to Sarah Mitchell had been found in my garden shed, carefully hidden behind some old paint cans. Cash that matched the serial numbers from her recent bank withdrawal was discovered in my bedroom dresser. There were receipts with my name on them for expensive items that I had never purchased. It was as if someone had built a perfect case against me, piece by piece, detail by detail. And the witness who had come forward to report all of this? Sarah Mitchell herself. Sweet, lonely Sarah from down the street, who had trusted me with her spare key when she went out of town, who had asked me to check on her house from time to time. She stood there in that courtroom, tears streaming down her face, and told the judge and jury how betrayed she felt, how violated, how she had trusted me and I had taken advantage of that trust. I sat there listening to her testimony, watching the jurors' faces as they took in every word, and I felt like I was living in a nightmare. This woman, who I had tried to be kind to, who I had invited into my home, was destroying my life with lies so convincing that even I began to question my own memory for brief moments. My lawyer, a public defender who seemed overwhelmed and underprepared, tried his best to poke holes in the prosecution AS case. But the evidence was too strong, too carefully constructed. The jury looked at me and saw a woman who had access to Sarah I.'s house, who knew her routines, who had the opportunity to take what didn't belong to her. They saw the physical evidence, heard the tearful testimony, and they made their decision. Guilty. The word hit me like a physical blow. Guilty of theft in the first degree. Guilty of breaking and entering. Guilty of crimes I had never committed, had never even imagined committing. The judge sentenced me to 3 years in state prison, and as the bailiff approached me with handcuffs, I looked out into the courtroom and saw my children's faces, saw the shock and disbelief in their eyes. But what I remember most clearly from that moment wasn't the fear or the confusion. It was the look on Sarah Mitchell's face. For just a split second, when she thought no one was watching, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. I saw satisfaction. I saw the look of someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this had all been planned, that I had been set up, that my life had been destroyed by someone who had spent months, maybe years, plotting against me. That look in Sarah's eyes would haunt me for the next 3 years. It would fuel the anger that grew inside me like a cancer. It would feed the desire for revenge that would consume my thoughts and my dreams. And it would ultimately lead me to a moment of choice that would define the rest of my life. Prison is not a place designed for someone like me. I was 42 years old, a middle-class woman who had never been in trouble with the law, surrounded by people who had lived lives I couldn't begin to understand. The first night, lying on that thin mattress in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, I cried until I thought I might never stop. I cried for my lost freedom, for my destroyed reputation, for the life that Sarah Mitchell had stolen from me. But tears don't last forever in a place like that. You learn quickly that weakness is dangerous, that vulnerability makes you a target. So I dried my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and began to build walls around my heart. I learned to keep my head down, to follow the rules, to avoid trouble. But most importantly, I learned to hate. Every morning when I woke up in that cell, the first thing I thought about was Sarah Mitchell. I thought about how she was probably sleeping peacefully in her own bed, in her own house, while I was trapped behind bars for crimes she had committed. I thought about how she had stood in that courtroom and lied with such conviction, such skill, that she had fooled everyone. I thought about how she had destroyed my life and walked away without any consequences. And I began to plan. During the long hours of my prison routine, during the sleepless nights when the sounds of the cell block kept me awake, I planned exactly what I would do to Sarah Mitchell when I got out. I would find evidence of what she had done. I would expose her for the liar she was. I would make sure that everyone in our small town knew the truth about who she really was. I would destroy her life just as thoroughly as she had destroyed mine. The planning became an obsession. It gave me something to focus on, something to live for. While other inmates talked about their families, their hopes for the future, their dreams of redemption, I talked about revenge. I studied Sarah Mitchell from a distance, learning everything I could about her through letters from people back home, through newspaper clippings, through any source of information I could find. I learned that she had been promoted at work after I was convicted. I learned that she had started dating someone new, a man who owned a small business in town. I learned that she had bought a new car, had gone on vacation, had seemed to be living her best life while I rotted in prison. And with each piece of information, my anger grew stronger. My desire for revenge burned brighter. The other inmates could see the hatred in my eyes. They could sense the darkness that was growing inside me. Some of them warned me that holding on to that kind of anger would destroy me from the inside out. But I didn't want to let go of it. That anger was all I had left. It was the only thing that made me feel powerful in a place where I had no power at all. I started working out obsessively, building physical strength to match the emotional hardness I was developing. I learned to fight when I had to stand up for myself in a world where mercy was a luxury I couldn't afford. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone who could look another person in the eye and promise them pain if they crossed me. But the real change wasn't physical, it was spiritual. The Margaret Thompson who had believed in goodness, who had trusted in justice, who had faith that everything happened for a reason, was dying a little more each day. In her place was growing someone harder, someone colder, someone who understood that the world was a cruel place where the innocent suffered and the guilty prospered. My children visited when they could, though each visit became more difficult. They could see the changes in me. could sense the anger that radiated from every word I spoke. David tried to encourage me to stay positive, to focus on proving my innocence. Sarah begged me to let go of the bitterness, to find peace somehow. But I couldn't hear them. All I could hear was the voice in my head that whispered about revenge, about making Sarah Mitchell pay for what she had done. The appeals process dragged on for months, then years. My new lawyer, hired with money my children had scraped together, found inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, raised questions about the evidence. But the wheels of justice moved slowly, and I had already been branded guilty in the court of public opinion. Even if I was eventually cleared, the damage to my reputation, to my life, had already been done. It wasn't until my second year in prison that the breakthrough came. A former friend of Sarah Mitchell, someone who had grown suspicious of Sarah's sudden good fortune after my conviction, had started asking questions. She had done some digging, had discovered some troubling inconsistencies in Sarah's story. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth began to emerge. Sarah Mitchell had been in financial trouble for years. She had gambling debts, credit card bills, and a spending problem that had spiraled out of control. She had been stealing from her employer, had been desperate for money, and had seen me as the perfect scapegoat. She had carefully planned the whole thing, planting evidence, creating fake receipts, building a case against me while covering her own tracks. The day I learned that my conviction was being overturned, that I was finally going to be released, should have been the happiest day of my life. But as I sat in my cell, holding the letter from my lawyer, all I could think about was Sarah Mitchell. All I could think about was the revenge I had been planning for almost 3 years. Finally, I would have my chance to destroy her just as she had destroyed me. I was released on a cold January morning in 2001. I walked out of that prison with the clothes on my back, a small bag of personal belongings, and a heart full of rage that had been burning for 34 months. My children were there to meet me, tears in their eyes, ready to help me rebuild my life. But I wasn't thinking about rebuilding. I was thinking about tearing down. The first thing I did when I got home was start gathering information about Sarah Mitchell. I wanted to know everything about her life, her relationships, her secrets. I wanted to find the perfect way to hurt her, to make her suffer as I had suffered. I had spent 3 years planning this moment, and now it was finally time to act. But as I stood in my old house, looking around at the life I had lost, I realized that revenge wasn't going to be as simple as I had imagined. Sarah Mitchell had moved on with her life. She had a new job, new friends, a new boyfriend. She had probably convinced herself that what she had done was justified somehow, that I had deserved what happened to me. And me? I was a 45-year-old woman with a criminal record, no job, no savings, and a reputation that would follow me for the rest of my life. I was starting over with nothing, while she had everything. The injustice of it all was almost too much to bear. That immense when I knew that simple revenge wouldn't be enough. I needed to destroy her completely, to make sure that everyone knew what she had done to me. I needed to plan something so devastating, so public, that she would never recover from it. And I had all the time in the world to make it happen. The woman who had gone to prison 3 years earlier had believed in justice, had trusted that the truth would set her free. But the woman who came home that January day knew better. She knew that if you wanted justice, you had to take it yourself. And she was ready to do exactly that. But what I didn't know, what I could not have imagined in my wildest dreams, was that the real battle was just beginning. The real test of who I was, who I wanted to be, was still ahead of me. And it would come in the most unexpected way, at the most impossible moment, when I finally came face to face with the woman who had destroyed my life. The story I'm about to tell you next will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, about justice, about what it means to be truly free. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge on your enemy. Sometimes it is discovering that you don't need to. The months following my release were the darkest of my entire life. And that as saying something, considering I had just spent 3 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit. But at least in prison, I had a routine, a purpose, even if that purpose was planning revenge. Now, back in the real world, I was discovering that freedom doesn't automatically mean liberation. My house felt like a museum of my former life. Everything was exactly as I had left it, preserved by my children who had hoped I would come home and pick up where I left off. But the woman who had lived in this house before was gone, replaced by someone harder, angrier, more determined to settle scores than to heal wounds. I walked through those familiar rooms like a ghost haunting her own life. The financial devastation was immediate and crushing. 3 years without income, legal fees that had drained my savings, and a criminal record that made finding employment nearly impossible. I had been a skilled nurse for 18 years, but no hospital would hire someone with a theft conviction. It didn't matter that the conviction had been overturned. The stain was permanent. The whispers would follow me everywhere. I applied for dozens of jobs, anything that would pay the bills and keep me from losing my house. Grocery stores, department stores, cleaning services. But in a small town, news travels fast. Everyone knew Margaret Thompson, the former nurse who had been convicted of stealing from her neighbor. The fact that I had been cleared didn't seem to matter to potential employers. They saw liability, controversy, someone who might bring negative attention to their business. David and Sarah, my children, tried their best to support me. They offered money, which hurt my pride more than helped my situation. They suggested I move away, start fresh somewhere else, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't let Sarah Mitchell think she had won completely. I couldn't let her believe that she had successfully run me out of town. So I stayed, and I planned. Every rejection letter, every suspicious look from former friends, every whispered conversation that stopped when I entered a room, fed the fire of my anger. Sarah Mitchell was living her life, enjoying her freedom, while I was trapped in a prison of reputation and circumstance. The physical bars were gone, but the cage was still there. I started following her. Not obviously, not in a way that would get me in trouble with the law, but carefully, systematically. I learned her schedule, her habits, her weaknesses. I watched her leave for work every morning from her house 3 doors down, watched her return every evening. I saw her boyfriend pick her up for dates, saw her laughing and smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent 3 years locked up while she lived freely. And now I was free, but spending my time watching her like a prisoner watches the world through bars. But this surveillance had a purpose. I was looking for something, anything, that would give me the leverage I needed to destroy her. And slowly, patiently, I began to find things. Sarah had secrets, just like everyone else. She had been embezzling money from her employer for years. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as she grew bolder. She had a gambling problem that she hid from her boyfriend, spending evenings at the casino in the next town over. She had been having an affair with a married man whose wife was one of her closest friends. Each discovery was like finding a piece of ammunition. I documented everything, took photographs, kept detailed records. I was building a case against her, just as she had built a case against me. But my case would be real, based on truth, not lies and planted evidence. The planning consumed me. I would sit in my living room for hours, surrounded by papers and photographs, working out the perfect strategy. I wanted to expose her publicly, to make sure everyone in town knew what she had really done. I wanted her to lose her job, her relationship, her reputation. I wanted her to experience the same humiliation and devastation she had put me through. My children were worried about me. They could see the obsession taking over my life, could sense the darkness growing inside me. David would visit and try to get me to talk about moving forward, about finding peace. Sarah would call and beg me to see a counselor, to get help processing what had happened to me. But I didn't want to move forward. I didn't want peace. I wanted justice, and I was going to get it myself. The breakthrough came almost a year after my release. I had been watching Sarah Ace routine for months, and I knew she went to the grocery store every Tuesday evening after work. I had been following her there, staying at a distance, just observing. But on this particular Tuesday, something was different. She was nervous, agitated, looking over her shoulder constantly. She was on her phone, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone. I managed to get close enough to hear fragments of what she was saying, and what I heard made my blood run cold. She was talking about me. She was telling someone that she was worried I was getting too close to the truth, that I was asking too many questions around town. She was scared that her carefully constructed lies were about to unravel. And then she said something that confirmed everything I had suspected for 3 years. "I know what I did to her was wrong," she said into the phone. "But I was desperate. I had no choice. If she finds out how I really got that evidence, if she proves I set her up, I'll lose everything." I stood there in the cereal aisle, holding a box of cornflakes, listening to the woman who had destroyed my life, casually admitting her guilt to someone on the phone. 3 years of my life stolen. My reputation ruined. My career ended. All because Sarah Mitchell was desperate and saw me as an easy target. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was pure, white-hot, consuming. I wanted to march over to her right then and there, to confront her, to make her confess publicly what she had just admitted privately. But I forced myself to stay calm, to think strategically. This was the moment I had been waiting for, and I wasn't going to waste it on an impulsive confrontation. Instead, I followed her home, watching from a distance as she paced around her living room, still on the phone. I could see her through the window, gesturing wildly, clearly upset about something. Whatever conversation she was having, it was intense, and it was about me. That night, I sat in my house and finalized my plans. I had enough evidence to destroy Sarah Mitchell completely. I had documentation of her embezzlement, proof of her affair, records of her gambling debts, and now I had heard her admit to framing me. It was time to act. I decided to confront her directly first, to give her a chance to confess publicly before I exposed everything I had learned. It wasn't a mercy, it was strategy. I wanted her to know that I knew everything, wanted to see the fear in her eyes when she realized that her carefully constructed life was about to collapse. The confrontation happened 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon. I had been watching her routine, and I knew she would be at the grocery store around 5:30. I positioned myself near the entrance, waiting for her to arrive. When she walked through those automatic doors, carrying her purse and looking distracted, I stepped directly into her path. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice calm and steady despite the storm raging inside me. She looked up and saw me, and the color drained from her face instantly. She knew. Somehow, she knew that this wasn't a coincidental encounter, that I was there for a specific reason. "Margaret," she stammered, trying to force a smile. "How are you doing? I heard about your case being overturned. That's wonderful news." The casualness of her tone, the fake concern in her voice, made me want to scream. This woman had destroyed my life, and now she was standing here acting like we were old friends catching up in the grocery store. "We need to talk," I said, my eyes never leaving hers. "Somewhere private." She glanced around nervously, probably hoping someone would interrupt us, give her an excuse to leave. But the store was relatively empty, and there was no escape from this conversation she had been dreading for months. "I'm actually in a bit of a hurry," she said, taking a step back. "Maybe we could talk another time." "No," I replied firmly. "We're going to talk now. You owe me that much." She could see the determination in my eyes, could sense that I wasn't going to let her walk away. Reluctantly, she nodded and followed me to a quiet corner of the store, near the pharmacy where we wouldn't be overheard. "Sarah," I began, my voice low and controlled, "I know what you did to me." Her face went pale again, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you mean, Margaret. I was just a witness in your case. I told the truth about what happened." "The truth?" I laughed bitterly. "You wouldn't know the truth if it slapped you in the face." "But I know the truth, Sarah. I know about the gambling debts. I know about the money you stole from your employer. I know about your affair with Tom Bradley. And I know how you planted that evidence in my shed." With each revelation, she seemed to shrink a little more. Her hands were shaking now, and she kept glancing toward the exit like she was planning to run. "I know you set me up," I continued, "and I have proof. I have photographs, documents, recordings. I have enough evidence to send you to prison for the rest of your life." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fear, of desperation, of someone who had been caught and was looking for a way out. "Margaret, please," she whispered. "You don't understand. I was in so much trouble. I had people threatening me, demanding money I didn't have. I was going to lose everything." "So you decided to destroy me instead?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. You decided that your problems were more important than my life? I never meant for it to go that far, she said, her voice breaking. I thought maybe I get probation, community service. I did not think you to actually go to prison. The casualness of her confession, the way she talked about destroying my life like it was a minor inconvenience, made me realize that she truly did not understand the magnitude of what she had done. She saw me as collateral damage in her own personal crisis, not as a human being whose life had value. 3 years, I said quietly. 3 years of my life, Sarah. 3 years in prison, surrounded by criminals, eating terrible food, sleeping on a thin mattress, being treated like garbage. 3 years of my children watching their mother being humiliated, of my reputation being destroyed, of my career being ended. 3 years of hell because you were too cowardly to face your own problems. She was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with the weight of what she had done. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but then I remembered the look on her face in that courtroom, the satisfaction I had seen when the verdict was read, and the pity disappeared. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry, Margaret. I know I cannot undo what I did, but I am sorry. Oh, I'm sorry doesn't it give me back 3 years of my life, I replied coldly. Sorry doesn't restore my reputation or my career. Sorry doesn't erase the pain you caused my family. She looked up at me with desperate eyes, and I could see that she was waiting for me to tell her what I wanted, what it would take to make this go away. She was still thinking like a criminal, still looking for an angle, a deal, a way to escape the consequences of her actions. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely audible. And that yes, when I told her exactly what I had planned. I was going to expose everything. I was going to call the police, the newspaper, her employer, her boyfriend. I was going to make sure everyone in town knew what she had really done. I was going to destroy her life just as completely as she had destroyed mine. She begged me not to do it. She promised to confess, to try to make things right somehow. But I had moved beyond the point where her promises meant anything to me. I had spent 3 years planning this moment, and I was going to see it through to the end. You had your chance to do the right thing, I told her. You could have come forward at any time during my trial, during my imprisonment, during the appeals process. You chose to stay silent and let me suffer. Now it's my turn to make choices. I left her there in the grocery store, crying and broken, and walked home to begin the process of destroying her life. I had everything I needed, all the evidence carefully organized and ready to be presented. By the end of the week, Sarah Mitchell would be exposed as a liar, a thief, and a woman who had sent an innocent person to prison to save herself. But as I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling triumphant, instead of feeling the satisfaction I had been anticipating for 3 years, I felt empty, hollow. The victory I had been working toward felt meaningless now that it was within my grasp. I realized that destroying Sarah Mitchell wouldn't give me back the 3 years she had stolen from me. It wouldn't restore my reputation or my career. It wouldn't erase the pain and humiliation my family had endured. It would just create more pain, more destruction, more lives ruined by the cycle of revenge and retaliation. And that as when I began to understand something that would change everything. Revenge wasn't going to set me free. It was just going to create a different kind of prison, one where I would be trapped by my own need for vengeance, my own inability to let go of the past. But letting go seemed impossible. How do you forgive someone who has destroyed your life? How do you find peace when justice feels so far away? How do you move forward when everything you worked for has been taken from you? I didn't have answers to those questions that night. All I knew was that the revenge I had been planning for 3 years suddenly felt like it would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. The question was whether I was strong enough to walk away from it, whether I could find another way to be free. The next morning, I woke up with a decision to make. I could follow through with my plan to destroy Sarah Mitchell, or I could try to find another path forward. But before I could make that choice, something happened that I never could have expected, something that would test everything. I thought I knew about justice, about forgiveness, and about what it really means to be free. Because sometimes, the universe has a way of putting you exactly where you need to be, at exactly the moment when you need to be there. And sometimes, The most important battles aren't fought against your enemies, but against the darkness inside yourself. That morning, I woke up with the weight of my decision pressing down on my chest like a physical force. The manila folders containing all the evidence against Sarah Mitchell sat on my kitchen table, organized and ready to be delivered to the police, the newspaper, and anyone else who would listen. 3 years of planning, months of investigation, and now the moment of truth had arrived. But something had changed during the night. The satisfaction I had expected to feel was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was this gnawing emptiness, this sense that even perfect revenge wouldn't fill the hole that had been carved out of my life. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at that table, staring at those folders, wondering if destroying Sarah Mitchell would really make me feel whole again. I had been so focused on making her pay that I hadn't stopped to consider what payment would actually look like. Would seeing her arrested make me feel better? Would watching her lose her job, her relationship, her reputation somehow restore what I had lost? The logical part of my brain knew the answer, but the angry part of my heart wasn't ready to accept it. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was David, my son, calling from Austin. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone he'd been using with me since my release. "How are you feeling today?" "I am fine," I lied, not ready to explain the internal battle raging inside me. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about you moving to Austin, starting fresh. There's a position at the hospital here, administrative work. It is not nursing, but it is in healthcare, and they willing to overlook your record because of the circumstances." The offer was generous, loving even. My children had been trying to help me rebuild my life, to move forward, but I had been too consumed with revenge to seriously consider their suggestions. Now, sitting with the evidence of Sarah's crimes in front of me, I realized that maybe they had been right all along. "I'll think about it," I said, surprising both of us. "Really?" David's voice brightened. "Mom, that is great. I think a fresh start is exactly what you need. You can keep living in the past, can keep carrying all this anger around. It is eating you alive." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, thinking about what he had said. The anger was eating me alive. I had become so focused on Sarah Mitchell's crimes that I'd forgotten to focus on my own healing. I had spent 3 years in prison, but I had spent the year since my release in a different kind of prison, one built from resentment and the need for revenge. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a walk. Not to follow Sarah, not to gather evidence, just to walk. I ended up at the small park in the center of town, sitting on a bench under an old oak tree that had been there since I was a child. I watched families playing, couples walking hand in hand, people living their lives without the weight of hatred pulling them down. And when I saw her, an elderly woman, maybe in her 70s, sitting alone on another bench about 50 feet away. She was reading a book, completely absorbed in whatever story had captured her attention. There was something peaceful about her, something that drew me in despite my general desire to avoid people these days. She looked up and caught me watching her. Instead of looking away awkwardly, she smiled and waved. There was something so genuine about that simple gesture that I found myself walking over to her bench. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said as I approached. "I am Helen. I don't think we met." "Margaret," I replied, sitting down beside her. "I used to come to this park when I was younger, but I haven't been here in years." "Sometimes we need to step away from familiar places for a while," Helen said, closing her book. "Gives us perspective when we come back." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the world go by. There was something about Helen's presence that felt calming, peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Finally, she spoke again. "You look like someone carrying a heavy burden," she said gently. I recognized that look because I carried it myself for many years. I don't know why, but something about her tone made me want to talk. Maybe it was because she was a stranger, someone who didn't know my story, someone who couldn't judge me based on my past. Or maybe it was because I was so tired of carrying the weight alone. "Someone hurt me," I said simply. "Hurt me badly, and I've been planning to hurt them back." Helen nodded, as if she understood completely. "Revenge is a powerful thing. she said. It can give you purpose, drive, something to live for when everything else has been taken away. But it is also a prison, isn't it? You become so focused on making the other person pay that you forget to focus on your own healing. Her words hit me like a physical blow because they were so accurate, so perfectly descriptive of what I had been experiencing. How do you know? I asked. Because I lived it, Helen replied. 40 years ago, my husband was killed by a drunk driver. Young man, 22 years old, coming home from a party. He hit my James head-on, killed him instantly. The boy survived without a scratch. I could see the pain in her eyes, even after all these years. I'm so sorry, I whispered. I spent 5 years planning how to destroy that young man's life, Helen continued. I wanted him to suffer like I was suffering. I wanted him to lose everything, just like I had lost everything. I became obsessed with it, consumed by it. I lost friends, lost family members who got tired of my anger. I lost myself. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I might not want to hear the answer. I got my revenge, she said simply. I found ways to hurt him, to make his life miserable. I succeeded in destroying him, just like I had planned. And you know what? It didn't bring James back. It didn't ease my pain. It didn't make me feel better. It just made me feel empty, hollow, like I had lost another piece of myself in the process. We sat in silence while I absorbed her words. Helen had been where I was now, had made the choice I was preparing to make, and had lived with the consequences. Her story was like looking into a crystal ball, seeing my future if I continued down the path I was on. How did you find peace? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I had to learn to forgive, Helen said. Not for his sake, but for mine. Forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It is about freeing yourself from the hook you've been hanging on. But how do you forgive someone who destroyed your life? How do you let go of that anger when it feels like it is the only thing keeping you strong? Helen smiled sadly. It is not easy. It took me years to understand that forgiveness isn't a feeling, it's a choice. You choose to forgive, and then you keep choosing it, every day, until one day you realize that the anger isn't controlling you anymore. I don't think I am strong enough, I admitted. You were stronger than you know, Helen said, placing her hand over mine. The fact that you were questioning your need for revenge shows that you were already stronger than I was at your age. It took me years to even consider that there might be another way. We talked for another hour, Helen sharing more of her story, me slowly opening up about my own experiences. By the time we parted ways, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't ready to forgive Sarah Mitchell, but I was ready to consider that maybe there was a path forward that didn't require destroying her. That evening, I called David back. About that job in Austin, I said. I'd like to hear more about it. Mom, that's wonderful, he exclaimed. I'll call them first thing Monday morning. This is going to be so good for you. A fresh start, a new beginning. But even as I made plans to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unfinished business with Sarah Mitchell. Not revenge necessarily, but closure. I needed to face her one more time, not as someone seeking vengeance, but as someone trying to find peace. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside Sarah's house, holding the manila folders containing all the evidence I had gathered against her. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt sad. Sad for both of us, really. Sad for the years we had both lost to fear and anger, and the terrible choices we had made. I knocked on her door. When she opened it and saw me standing there, the color drained from her face. Margaret, she whispered, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you, I said calmly. May I come in? She hesitated, probably wondering if this was the moment when her carefully constructed world would finally collapse. But she stepped aside and let me in. Her living room was neat and tidy, filled with pictures of her and her boyfriend, souvenirs from trips they had taken together. It was the home of someone who had been trying to build a life, even if that life had been built on lies and deception. I know you expecting me to expose everything, I said, settling into the chair across from her. I know you waiting for me to destroy your life the way you destroyed mine. She nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. I deserve whatever you do to me, she said quietly. I know that. I've known it for years. The thing is, I continued, destroying you when it give me back what you took from me. It won and restore my reputation or my career. It won to erase the pain you caused my family. It will just create more pain, more destruction. Sarah looked confused, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't following through on my threats. What do you want from me then? She asked. I want to understand, I said. I want to understand how someone can destroy another person's life and live with themselves. I want to understand how you could look me in the eye every day, knowing what you had done. She broke down then, sobbing like a child. I was so scared, she whispered. I was in so much debt, so much trouble. I thought if I could just buy myself some time, find a way to pay back the money I had stolen, maybe I could fix everything. But it just got worse and worse. So you decided to frame me? I asked, though my voice was gentler than it had been in our previous conversations. I thought it would be easy, she admitted. You were so trusting, so kind. You gave me your spare key, let me into your life. I thought maybe you'd just get probation, community service. I never imagined you'd actually go to prison. But when I did go to prison, you said nothing. When I was suffering, when my family was suffering, you said nothing. How do you live with that? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I haven't had a peaceful night, sleep in 7 years. Every time I see you, every time someone mentions your name, I feel sick. I've wanted to confess 1,000 times, but I was too much of a coward. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke again. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked at her, this broken woman who had caused so much pain, and made a decision that surprised even me. I'm going to forgive you, I said simply. She stared at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. What? I am going to forgive you, I repeated. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free from the anger and hatred that had been eating me alive for years. But the evidence, she said, looking at the folders I had brought. Aren't you going to use it? No, I said, standing up. I am going to destroy it. I am going to let it go, and I am going to move forward with my life. I'm moving to Austin, starting over, leaving all of this behind. I don't understand, Sarah said. After everything I did to you, how can you just forgive me? Because holding on to the anger was destroying me, I explained. Because revenge wouldn't bring back what I lost. Because I want to be free, really free, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I walked to her fireplace, where a small fire was burning. One by one, I fed the folders into the flames, watching months of investigation and evidence turn to ash. With each folder that burned, I felt lighter, freer, more like the person I had been before all of this started. Margaret, Sarah said, her voice shaking, I don't know what to say. You don't, I'd have to say anything, I replied. But I need you to understand something. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It does not mean that what you did was okay. It just means that I'm choosing not to let it control my life anymore. As I prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed my arm. Will you ever be able to truly forgive me? She asked. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had caused me so much pain, who had stolen 3 years of my life and destroyed my reputation. And I realized that in that moment, standing in her living room, watching my evidence burn, I already had forgiven her. I already have, I said. It is not about you, Sarah. It is about me. It is about choosing freedom over bondage, peace over anger, love over hate. It is about deciding that my future is more important than my past. I left her house that day and never looked back. Within a month, I had moved to Austin, started my new job, and begun building a new life. It was not the life I had originally planned, but it was a good life, a peaceful life, a life built on forgiveness rather than revenge. Today, 24 years later, I can honestly say that forgiving Sarah Mitchell was the best decision I ever made. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to be free. I deserved to live without the weight of hatred pulling me down. I deserved to find peace, joy, and purpose again. I never saw Sarah again after that day. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually confessed to her crimes and served some time in prison. I felt sad for her, but I also felt proud that she had finally found the courage to face the truth. Healing, it seems, comes in many forms. My life in Austin has been everything I could have hoped for and more. I worked at the hospital for 15 years before retiring, made new friends, watched my grandchildren grow up, and found love again with a wonderful man named William, who accepted my past without judgment. More importantly, I found my faith again. The woman who had lost her belief in justice and goodness during those dark years slowly rediscovered that there is still light in the world, still hope, still reasons to believe in the power of forgiveness and redemption. I started volunteering at the local prison, sharing my story with inmates who were struggling with their own anger and desire for revenge. I learned that my experience, as painful as it was, could be used to help others find their own path to freedom. There's something powerful about being able to look someone in the eye and say, "I understand what you were going through, and I am here to tell you that there is another way." The inmates I work with often ask me the same question Sarah asked that day. How do you forgive someone who destroyed your life? And I always give them the same answer. You don't forgive them for their sake, you forgive them for yours. Forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It is about you deserving to be free. Some of them get it right away. Others take years to understand. A few never get it at all. But I keep sharing my story because I know that for every person who finds freedom through forgiveness, the world becomes a little bit brighter, a little bit more hopeful. Looking back now, I can see that my 3 years in prison weren't the worst thing that happened to me. The worst thing was the years I spent in the prison of my own anger and hatred. Physical bars can be opened, but the bars we build around our own hearts are much harder to break. I think about Helen sometimes, the woman I met in the park who helped me understand that revenge wasn't the answer. I never saw her again after that day, but her words stayed with me, guided me toward a different path. I wonder if she knew that our conversation would change my life completely, or if she was just sharing her own hard-won wisdom with someone who needed to hear it. To anyone who might be listening to this story, anyone who is carrying anger or hatred or the desire for revenge in their heart, I want you to know that I understand. I understand the pain, the injustice, the feeling that the only way to find peace is to make the other person pay. I understand because I lived it, breathed it, planned it for years. But I also want you to know that there is another way. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it is strength. It's not about letting someone off the hook. It is about freeing yourself from the hook. It's not about forgetting what happened. It is about choosing not to let what happened control your future. The road to forgiveness isn't easy. It's not a one-time decision. It's a daily choice. Some days are harder than others. Some days the old anger tries to creep back in, and you have to choose forgiveness all over again. But each time you choose it, it gets a little easier. Each time you choose it, you get a little freer. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I spent 3 years in prison for crimes I did not commit. But the real prison was the one I built in my own heart out of anger and hatred and the need for revenge. The day I chose to forgive was the day I truly became free. If you are carrying a burden of anger or hatred, if you were planning revenge against someone who hurt you, I want you to consider that maybe there's another way. Maybe true justice isn't about making the other person pay, but about refusing to let their actions continue to hurt you. Maybe real freedom isn't about getting even, but about getting free. The choice is yours. It's always been yours. You can choose to stay in the prison of anger and hatred, or you can choose to forgive and walk free. It's not an easy choice, but it's the most important one you'll ever make. Because at the end of the day, the person who benefits most from your forgiveness isn't the person who hurt you. It is you. And you deserve to be free. You deserve to find peace. You deserve to live a life that isn't controlled by the worst thing that ever happened to you. That is my story, and that is my message. Forgiveness isn't about them. It is about you. Choose freedom. Choose peace. Choose forgiveness. Your future self will thank you for it. God bless you all, and may you find the strength to choose forgiveness, just as I did on that day when I burned the evidence and chose to let go of the past. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the best thing I ever did. And if I can do it, so can you.